Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar that we're doing with the Activism and Social Justice Division at the NCA, the National Communication Association. This is part of a working group that we wanted to explore issues and topic of the annual conference, but things that are really important issue for us to share and talk about. So we deeply appreciate the pioneering group who is working to put this special webinar together. And thank you for David Palmer to organizing with me this session. So Satarupa, I'll let you introduce each one of the panelists and the topics so that we can start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie. And thanks to everyone for attending this webinar. It's such a beautiful Saturday afternoon and we are attending a webinar. Thank you so much for coming to this. So our webinar is titled Activism, Social Justice and Intersectionality, Critical Pedagogical Practices in the Communication Classroom. So we are bringing together speakers who are focusing on centralizing activism, social justice, and equality across the varied realms of communication pedagogy. And we are also highlighting intersectionality as a critical pedagogical practice. The first two speakers are Ruma Sen from Rampo College of New Jersey and Anjali from Roger Williams University. They are going to talk about incorporating a social justice approach in intercultural communication pedagogy while engaging international students in a racialized landscape. Our second speaker is Regina from Rampo College of New Jersey. She will talk about how college campuses are dealing with the intersection of culture, politics, and race, while also speaking about her experience of creating a Black Lives Matter colloquium. And the third speaker is me, Satarupa Dasgupta. I'm also from Rampo College of New Jersey. I will talk about an intersectional approach towards communication activism pedagogy while highlighting my own experience as a violence prevention advocate in New Jersey. So these are the speakers, and I think Ruma and Anjali will start first. So I will hand over the mic.
Thank you so much, Satarupa. We are both co-presenting, so I'm going to start us off and then hand it over to Ruma. So I'm going to share my screen. So can everyone see that? Yeah, right. So for our presentation, we both teach intercultural communication through, and we want to sort of talk about how we sort of use a social justice lens in both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So to give a little sort of background, right? Questions about history, inclusion, power are very, very imperative. We want to really be self-reflexive about our own discipline and to engage ourselves and our students in social justice. However, for the field of intercultural communication comes out of a history where these questions were avoided. Edward T. Hall, who has been credited as sort of the founding figure of our field, was commissioned by the US Foreign Service to conduct intercultural communication training. And he has been reported to say that the Foreign Service officers would often declare that they had no interest in knowing how to work with the Navajo because we didn't have an embassy on the Navajo Nation. Such a utilitarian sort of approach combined with sort of an imperialist desire for the US to procure selective knowledge about other cultures echoes even today in some mainstream intercultural communication textbooks and scholarship. So I was fortunate when I started my teaching career as an assistant professor that mainstream intercultural communication started being challenged by a critical turn to be more self-reflexive and to center questions of power, globalization, social justice, and so on. And so I brought that into my pedagogy right from the early years of my teaching. Thanks to my colleague, Dr. Ruma Sen, I was introduced to Catherine Sorrell's textbook, Intercultural Communication, Globalization, and Social Justice, that allowed me to align my intercultural communication classroom better with what Bell Hooks calls as engaged pedagogy. And here are some sort of quotes of what she sort of says. She talks about the classroom is really a location of possibility And here's where we get to confront both the biases that have shaped our teaching practices and create and imagine new ways of knowing, different strategies for sharing knowledge. And so with that kind of approach underpinning my teaching approach, I always kept self-reflexivity was sort of central to all my class discussions. And a quote that always inspired me by Arthur Kleinman, a medical anthropologist, kind of drove that focus on self-reflection, which was that if you're unable to see that your own culture has its own sets of interests, emotions, and biases, how can you expect to deal successfully with someone else's culture? And that was a radical shift from the mainstream approaches. So in my kind of intercultural classroom, self-reflexivity was the focus, but what I felt I wasn't doing enough was also sort of encouraging my students to think about allyship and advocacy. So this last year, I kind of had the support of my institution, a fellowship from my institution called the Hassenfeld Faculty Fellowship that allowed me to think about community partnership and engagement. And I've been exploring ways for my students to think about how they could practice allyship and advocacy. Now, rather than using a typical service learning project with a community partner, I designed a final project that encouraged my students to think about how to translate their understanding of intercultural communication to larger communities in different ways. And so one of the first things that I had them do for a final project was to create a curated archive of resources for a community partner or for a larger community in general. We live in a world where information more often creates heat than light with all the misinformation that we have. And so learning to sift and sort through information and providing updated, credible, and accessible information was a first step, I thought, for my intercultural communication students to learn about creating awareness around social justice. So they had to choose a theme related to social justice. And here are some examples of what they did. One was related to immigration and healthcare, and the other was having difficult dialogues, especially around race and racial justice. The next step that they had then was to build a communication toolkit. And I sort of had them have sort of three options for that. And the first one was to think about a toolkit to have difficult interpersonal dialogues. Beverly Tatum was an inspiration here, where she said that particularly white people are socialized to be color silent. And a lot of my students in my classroom do come from are dominantly positioned and are predominantly white. And for them to sort of engage with conversations with their family members, with friends around issues, especially around race and other social justice issues, is a challenge. And so this was about creating toolkits where they could do that kind of work within their own sort of close circle. But a lot of them kind of wanted to broaden that a little bit. And the second option, and this was what they chose the most, was to think about lesson plans and facilitation kinds of approaches from the K to 12 sort of a system to provide from elementary school teachers, middle school teachers, and high school teachers to talk about issues around social justice. A lot of them said that they wish that they had more of that when they were in school, and so that's the option they chose. And they did a really good job in terms of coming up with like week-long lesson plans. This is an example of an Instagram sort of site that they created called Come Out With Us to talk about issues around LGBTQ issues. And then finally, for some students, it was sort of to go even sort of bigger and think about how to become an advocate around certain issues related to social justice. And here they sort of created sort of toolkits related to letter templates for elected officials, to create facilitation dialogues, how to do a town hall meeting around issues, especially around environmental justice. That was sort of a big thing for them as they did. So creating blueprints for communication toolkits and sort of creating a curated sort of resource was sort of my way of getting them to think beyond the classroom. So one of the things that I've been trying, it's just beginning, it's the first year, so I have a lot of reinvention, reimagination to do here. But I hope that part of what I am trying to do is to push my intercultural communication to think beyond the pale and politically bland, and to take a step towards social justice. So I'm going to hand that over now to my co-presenter, Ruma Sen, who is going to continue that conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. I will start sharing now. Okay. Yes, you can say great, thank you. Okay, so like Dr. Ram was saying, I too have been teaching intercultural communication for over, well, actually almost 2 decades now, not quite yet, and have witnessed the evolution of this field from the way in which we were taught, as eloquently discussed by Anjali, to a more engaged, context-driven and activism-oriented form of the discipline today. So what began with the leading stalwarts in the field like Nakiam and Martin was brought forward by those who, like Rona Halwalani, Wendy Leeds Horowitz, who also created this intercultural, critical intercultural dialogue group, and then followed through by the books, like the one that was mentioned by Dr. Ram, by Catherine Sorrells, which kind of incorporated these pedagogical practices of today, which can be accessible both within the classroom and in a social justice-oriented forum or workshop. So for my part, I wanted to focus on this element of it, critical intercultural communication perspective, just give you some orientation to it and then move from there. So the definition from Rona Halwalani's intercultural dialogue piece is that it provides a comprehensive and dialogic view of intercultural communication, culture, and identity. It really focuses on not just thinking about individuals' lived experiences and their lives and the impact of those, but the metonymic relationship between that and other forms of intercultural relations, the media, government, economy, history, global markets, popular culture, all of it together, and how all of these intersect with each other. And of course, the common thread and the common element there is power. Therefore, this perspective lends itself very easily, as several of us now argue, to talking about activism and social justice. That we no longer need to speak about intercultural communication as in just a discipline within communication, but more about as a tool, as a way of thinking that can be moved into how we rethink, how we rethink and apply these tools into social justice, into the social justice framework. So part of this, why we use critical intercultural perspective is because we cannot talk about ICC without addressing context and power, like dominant and minoritized representations of culture, where meanings are both shared and contested or negotiated. So it is constantly about that tension between meanings being shared as well as being contested. What I want to keep tabs of time. Yonti, can you give me a sense of where we are with time?
We're 1:17, so we have time.
Thank you.
We're good.
All right. And one that also involves what Dr. Ram already mentioned, self-reflexivity, but self-reflection of anyone engaged in that conversation, anyone engaged in intercultural dialogue, to learn to recognize and reflect on, reflect on our individual frames of reference, our individual ways of seeing the world, our interrogating and our positionalities, and recognizing that how we are complicit, how we might be complicit in perpetuating iniquities. So not just the unequal frames of distribution, but also iniquity in sense of lack of social justice, and recognizing the systemic injustices that go along with it. So terms, what do terms such as mutual respect and getting along, what do these terms exclude? What does that therefore mean in terms of how we move forward any conversation where we do not include all of the different ways of seeing and thinking? And this self-reflection is necessary regardless of whether my classroom is comprised of a majority of white American students with a few minority voices who are either rendered silent or framed as the other, or whether it is the case of an intercultural communication workshop with international students. And that's the case that I want to discuss today. So this workshop series was initiated by the Ruma Center for International Education at Rampo College. It was a campus initiative to engage international students to use intercultural communication in how they reflect on their educational journey in the United States. By recognizing the way in which international students are inserted into this racialized landscape, the aim was to provide students with tools to have conversations on social justice while navigating the outsider-insider dilemma. So this workshop was designed to learn how to think critically about their own positioning and identity in the context of the current campus conversations around social justice and difference. Quite often, international students are inserted in these conversations, find themselves in it, whether it's in the classroom or in any small group setting, without having the tools of engagement, because their experiences with these conversations are from the perspective of the outsider. And often this is also not something that they may have necessarily discussed when they were back home. Just to also give a context, the reason why we started doing this at Rampo was because recognizing that many of our international students either were here for a year or less and then returned to their home countries and are now taking these classes from their home countries, or have never set foot. And most likely, we were targeting those mainly freshmen who had never even set foot in America, but now were actively engaged in these conversations about America that they had to participate in based on the classroom that they were in, without having the tools to know what is going on and how to engage in these conversations. They can be reading the New York Times and or following CNN and anybody else on Instagram and so on, but they still don't have the tools for engagement. And of course, it also comes from, like Dr. Ram also mentioned, it comes from our own experiences of having been international students when we first started here, and what that meant to be in the intercultural communication classroom, where we were the outsider that often was the focus of the conversation in the text. So we weren't the insider engaging in the conversation where the rest of the class was, but we were the outsider. So we were bringing that thinking into this workshop and what that would mean for the students. And that's why this was constructed more like a workshop where we were constantly engaging the students in participating through talking about their experiences, their observations, and what their reflections had been so far. So the discussion on what it means to be an international student on an American college campus in the midst of all the climate of social movements, and this racialized context, how this racialized context and the conversations happening around whitewashing and racial consciousness impacts them. What kind of sense they're making out of it? What does it mean for them? How do they take these conversations and move forward with it? How do they see themselves inserted in that conversation? What is their level of engagement, as opposed to how do they see themselves positioned vis-a-vis, are they talking about themselves as a Nepali student, or they're talking about themselves as just Samrat or whoever he is, just himself? So the value of recognizing that all of them have their voice, they speak to a story, but it is only their story. It is not a representative narrative. So also to learn to disengage from this expectation of the outsider to then represent, and typically for international students, then to represent the country or a story that they come from, the place where they come from. Just one more example that I want to give. as part of this, what happened? So as part of this workshop, what we focused on, we draw from Catherine Sorrell's book, The Intercultural Praxis Model, and which basically uses this framework as a tool to use as we think about, analyze, reflect, and act with regard to cultural differences. How do we do that? How do we practice this negotiation? And finally, it's not moving quickly enough. All right, and in the interest of time, I just want to talk about how two of these concepts, and I'll focus on framing and positioning, were used to illustrate how power and location are negotiated in intercultural exchanges. So as we move along in the workshop, we engage the students in discussing the significance of perspective consciousness to understand how our frames limit or restrict our ways of seeing. We discuss how we must always be aware of our frames of reference and that each of us carries with ourselves individual, cultural, national, and regional lenses, which impact how we look at the world. And as the workshop moves on, we engage the students in either a small group or a think, pair, share activity that allows them to reflect on their own experiences so far, things that would trigger them in terms of how they heard a question and they were asked a question and how they responded in the classroom. They would exchange that experience or that reflection with their peers, and then reflect back and share back with the larger, the workshop group. And then moving on to the next stage, which is our positioning, which is our socially constructed structures of difference, and discuss how our own locations, where they come from, for instance, which country, community, culture they come from, and as well as where they are in the moment, their location of being the outsider, looking into the classroom, as well as in some ways being as equally engaged in the classroom as any other so-called insider American student. So what that tension, what that dilemma means in terms of understanding these two, both material and symbolic locations and the consequences of those. And once again, do this in terms of asking for student feedback about what it reminds them of, what kinds of experiences it reminds them of, and then engaging in that dialogue. And we believe that that is what we obviously intend to continue to develop this workshop. And we believe that this is going to, in the long run, once they hopefully come back to the campus, they engage more with campus activities, campus organizations, and so on, they will find a way in which to continue to reflect on this journey of theirs, coming into America, their coming to America journey, and eventually go beyond their campus experience into what it could possibly mean for all intercultural, the scope for all intercultural dialogue in the future, and hopefully help them in building confidence, in finding their voices and gaining a better sense of belonging in this new community. Just one last thing that I just thought of right now, which is, I think there is a lot of scope here, because it isn't just about the international students. We're looking at them as a way in which to try out how these tools can be used by those who are not necessarily always engaging with intercultural communication praxis, but for them to use it and think about it. But I believe this kind of using our tools of what we teach in the classroom into activism, into practical ways in which that we can organize, become more conscious about the world in which we live, and then find the tools to engage and interact with this world. I think intercultural communication, these kinds of tools will definitely be useful in the long run. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we'll keep moving, and I'm going to go ahead and just share the right screen this time, the desktop. Let's see. I don't see it this time. Okay, let's try that again. Have it queued up. Looks like there's a delay on my desktop. Okay, there we go. So let me go ahead and share, but good afternoon. My name is Regina Clark. Can you see that okay now? Yes, okay. And so I'm coming from a little bit of a different place. I'm an associate professor of journalism over at Rampo. I'm in the communication arts major. And so what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about, as I call this, examining intersectionality via Black Lives Matter on campus, and really taking a look at what's been going on in the news and in the world around us, and how we decided to respond to that as a campus. And it's, okay, I'll do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, all right, so it's really, there we go. And so where to begin? How this started for us over at Rampo. Obviously, we all remember the spring and summer of 2020. In the middle of this pandemic, we began to hear about these tragedies, right? The killing of Ahmaud Arbery. He was the jogger in Georgia who was killed as he was just jogging in his own neighborhood. Of course, Breonna Taylor, most recently, George Floyd, and others. And so we were in the middle of, again, a semester online when all of this was going on, but there was this idea that we needed to do something. And what we were seeing was this idea of collective trauma, right, amongst persons of color, amongst our student body, especially students of color. And we also were witnessing and some participating in this time of national and even international protest. So one of the questions that arose as we as faculty started throwing around ideas and really discussing what could be done was the question of whether we would address this through private and separate classroom discussions, or whether we should do something on a larger scale as a more public discourse. And that's ultimately where the idea of this colloquium came in, because there are faculty who are well equipped to have these types of conversations, as we can see from Ruma and Anjali. And then there are others who are less comfortable with that idea. So again, we were looking at what were our options at this time. So again, when we were talking about that intersectionality, part of what we were trying to do is to navigate race, culture, and politics on our current day college campus and how we would engage in that. So again, we opened this initial discussion online. We were fully virtual at the time, of course, and just throwing around ideas, responding to one another. So the first step for us was really to try to determine what would be our roles as faculty during this time. And how would we get more buy-in from our campus community? And we're talking faculty, staff, and students. How would we get more campus buy-in when it comes to this idea of taking some form of action and responding to what was going on in the world regarding Black Lives Matter, regarding the killing of Black and Brown people? And so ultimately, we again came up with this idea of trying to facilitate some type of forum for open discussion. Would this be a town hall? Would this be something done individually by each college, or something more campus-wide? But we did know that if nothing else, we wanted to do something that showed some form of support, right? A show of support for our student body. And so that's where we were headed. So for us, the blueprint, right? What we decided we would do was seek larger campus involvement led by faculty, but again, getting more involvement and buy-in from both students as well as those who are part of our campus community. What was really important for us was to take a more interdisciplinary approach. So by that, I mean, we wanted to have faculty from as many schools as possible throughout the campus. And I'll give an example of that in a few minutes. We wanted to acknowledge and recognize the impact that all of this was having, particularly on students of color. And of course, the larger student body. There were a lot of students who were not students of color, who were very much involved in protests or speaking out, and who were distraught by what they saw going on. And so I should mention also that we did have a letter, of course, and I'm sure many schools did that, the president of the college, broadcast a letter via email condemning what was going on and showing support. And so for us, it was, okay, what more can we do? That's good, that's great, but what more can we do? And so ultimately, it was this idea of a faculty-led colloquium. And Black Lives Matter. Why Black Lives Matter, right? That became kind of this rallying cry, and they definitely existed before the killing of George Floyd and what was happening last year, but we saw things shifting. And so we took a very we made the very conscious decision of calling this colloquium series Black Lives Matter at Ramapo. Embracing that controversy, understanding this politics of mattering, right? You'd heard the phrases, all lives matter, blue lives matter, which of course that's true, but we wanted to make a very conscious decision to state Black Lives Matter at Ramapo. Again, part of that show of support and part of that embracing and challenging what that actually means, how people interpret that. And each of these sessions would help us to address that. So some of what we did through this colloquium was to address some of these issues of race and racism via our actual disciplines, right? So we were able to, by that way, work from a position in areas of strength. We're not all, counselors or psychologists or specialists in other areas, but we were able to share through areas of strength. And I will give an example of what I did. So this is the flyer that went out, gives you a sense. So the full name was Black Lives Matter, College Colloquium on Race, Social Justice, and Representation. I'm realizing how small that is on this particular screen. But again, there were a variety of sessions. I led off. And so what I did as part of the colloquium was just so happens that my parents were students at Ramapo. My father became almost an unwilling student activist. So he shared his story. And it was really about how Black and Brown students, particularly the Black and the Latinx student bodies, came together because this was the early 1970s. Ramapo is a fairly young school, by the way, if you're not familiar, established in the late 1960s, around 1969. My father was part of the first graduating class. And so I actually conducted an interview with him. I shared some of the facts, some newspaper clippings. We made the New York Times. I mean, this was a big deal at the time that students were protesting and speaking up for their rights. So shared some of that history as a way of both empowering and enlightening students in terms of this is the rich history we have to share here at Ramapo. Some of the other sessions were from a business perspective. One of our colleagues presented about Black entrepreneurship and the digital divide. I'm just going to switch because those are so small. I think this shows us a little bit more. And so here's what we presented. So it was featured as a 1-credit course option. You did not have to take it for a credit, but if you wanted to get credit for taking the course, that was one way of participating. We were pleasantly surprised. We had also staff and faculty who came and attended. So it was pretty much a campus-wide endeavor. And again, so I covered kind of the history of Black and Brown student activism at the college. We had another faculty colleague who spoke about the prison system. He presented a film, Slavery by Another Name, that gave us really the history, the connection between slavery and the imprisonment of Black males, even until this day. And we're actually seeing that in the larger community as marijuana and other types of offenses are, those are being treated differently now. We also had a colleague who spoke on how photographic imaging actually leads to racial profiling. So it was just really interesting for us as members of the campus community to hear from our colleagues in their areas of expertise sharing. And again, as I mentioned, one colleague shared about the challenges of minority entrepreneurship and the digital divide. And she actually hosted a panel and had several entrepreneurs from our local communities come together and talk about what they've dealt with, how that actually changed during COVID. So we try to be very of the moment throughout this. Let's see, and another colleague actually presented about statewide, not just campus-wide, but statewide, this history of protest that we've seen right here in New Jersey from the 1960s into the 1970s. And so again, that was an idea that we spent a little time on. It was our first run. And so we had some time for reflection and evaluation. One thing that we were less satisfied with, we used WebEx for our, originally it was of course supposed to be in person, but COVID obviously interfered with that. And so using WebEx did not always allow us to see the students or to see who was asking questions in terms of that interactivity. So we took some time for evaluation and reflection and looked at how we could improve upon it. But one thing we were certain of was that we should continue with this colloquium. So moving forward, we're definitely going to host it again for the fall of 2021. Going to continue to collaborate with faculty, but now both inside and outside of Rampo, and actually bringing in guest speakers and others who are from outside of the Rampo campus community. It was important to us that first time, the first run, to keep it kind of close to home, but now we are actually looking at going beyond the campus. And we're also adding a film element because of the success of the movie that I mentioned. Our colleague, Carl Johnson, who is in the Africana Studies major, presented a film that students were able to pre-watch, and then he gave his lecture, and then there was some dialogue. So we really like the way that interactivity worked, and we're planning to have, hopefully for each section, a film connected with that. So again, that just came out of our reflection and evaluation. And I think that is pretty much it. Let me stop my screen here and pass the baton, so to speak. Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see it? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about an intersectional approach towards communication, pedagogy, activism that's centered on violence prevention. I'm going to talk about my research, the work that I do, and how I bring it to my classroom. So I will start with intersectional advocacy, but before I do that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my research. My research focuses on violence prevention among vulnerable populations like commercial sex workers, prevention of sex trafficking, and rehabilitation of sex trafficking survivors in international settings. I also work in intimate partner violence support service provision among immigrant communities in the US. But other than being an academic, I am also a trained domestic violence support services advocate. I'm also a trained sexual assault support services advocate in my state, like in New Jersey, where I live. And I have been affiliated with culturally specific organizations that provide support services to immigrant victims of violence. So that's my work, that's my research, and that's my work. That's the work that I do other than being an academic. And my teaching is informed by that work, my research, as well as my other work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectional advocacy, how like social justice issues collide. So the term intersectionality was first used by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She was a civil rights activist and a legal scholar. She talked about intersectionality, a lens through which you can see where power comes from and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. So for the past half decade, the term intersectionality has been used to describe the way that people from different cultures, different backgrounds, they experience the world, experience the struggles that they face as a result of discrimination. So marginalized communities, they have been affected by systemic oppressions that already existed that make them susceptible to human rights violation. I'm going to give an example of trafficking. I work in trafficking. I work in sex trafficking primarily, but then human trafficking, it does not evade the overlapping, the complex forms of discrimination that affects the marginalized communities. There is racism in trafficking, there's sexism, there's classism. All of these fall in connection in human trafficking. So recognizing that there are multiple forms of systemic discrimination in place and understanding how they intersect in human trafficking is very important. This is where the intersectional advocacy part comes in. Now, this is not black and white. There are a lot of gray shades. I work with trafficking survivors. I work in the field of trafficking. So thing is, all the work that we do, grant-funded work, project development, is all about rescue and rehabilitation of trafficking survivors. But thing is, Most of the trafficking survivors that I know of, they had paid their life savings to the traffickers to get trafficked so that they can work in the work that they're doing. Like I work with sex workers, and if you look at it in most research grant funding, sex work is conflated with sex trafficking, but they're not the same. Some sex workers are indeed trafficked, but they have paid their life's money savings to the traffickers to take them across the border to the red light area so that they can work and send that money back to their families because they need to survive, because their families need to survive. But that is not how we look at it. Because like all the grant funding, international foundations that I've worked with, I myself have applied for those grants. It's all for rescue and rehabilitation because people have to be rescued because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what's good for them, especially when it comes to sex work. Because for sex workers, like the whole emphasis is on rescuing. So like the grant funders, the foundations, they will give us money. They call sex work commercial exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation of people. So those people who are in sex work, they don't know what they're doing. They're being exploited. They need to be saved. That is the whole perspective. But thing is, how do you save people who don't want to be saved at all? Who want to do that job because it offers them a good economic proposition, because it's a job that through which they earn money. They earn a good amount of money, they send it back to the families. But we only see it through a moral lens. We cannot believe that people can go into sex work out of their own volition, that they can pay traffickers money so that they can do that job, and they are not sex slaves. We don't think about it because we look at it through a moral lens. I think this is where intersectionality has to come in, that we cannot have a black and white understanding of trafficking, sex work. So I try to incorporate these, like when I'm teaching. For instance, I teach a course on health communication, theory and practice of health communication, where I talk about generating health activism. How do we understand violence prevention? How do we reduce health disparities? So I dedicate several classes there to talk about intimate partner violence, or violence in general, violence prevention. How do we offer an intersectional understanding of intimate partner violence, abuse? How do we highlight the contextualization of response to violence through the lens of gender, race, sexuality, economics, and even like immigration status? So I just want to show you this. Like I show this to my students too. I show this in class. This is the power and control wheel. So this is a tool that's used in domestic violence, interpersonal violence, to understand the tactics that abusers use to gain control, gain power over their victims. This wheel was created by the domestic abuser intervention programs as part of the Duluth model. So this focuses on training communities so that communities can come together to shift the blame where it belongs, to shift the blame on the abuser, the perpetrator, not on the victims. Because the whole issue of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, thrives on victim blaming, even culturally. So this is to shift the blame to where it belongs. So if you look at it, there is when we think of violence, we think about physical violence. Most people can't think beyond that. But violence, abuse comes in many, many, many different forms. There's coercion and threats, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, blaming, economic abuse. All these falls under abuse. So I show this in class, and there's another thing. This didn't come that well, but this is the risk and danger assessment tool. This was developed by Jacqueline Campbell, who is a professor in nursing at Johns Hopkins. So basically, she developed this tool in order to understand the level of danger that an abused woman faces. At the highest level of danger, she is at the risk of getting killed by a partner. But it also shows things like you have to do a weighted scoring here and interpretation, and you can only do it after you have completed a training. You can only administer it after you have completed a training. But it shows a lot of things in here. Like, does your partner have a gun? Does he have a firearm? Does he do illegal drugs? Does he threaten to kill you? Is he into coercive sex? So thing is, we don't think about this when we think about abuse. Some of them. It's not only our students. I've seen most people don't have a limited understanding of abuse. But thing is, when I show this to people, people kind of have a self-reflection. It's like introspection. So I've seen like people like think like, oh, okay, so even this is considered to be abuse. So I had this relationship. So at the end that my partner did this, was this abuse? So people think about this. Now, I want my students to understand, like, you know, like in academia, we come across a lot of theoretical perspectives, but there is a whole life beyond it, and things work a little bit different in real life. So I want them to have an understanding what abuse means, what response to abuse means, what is the definition of violence, what does violence incorporate. And it's interesting, like, because, you know, like after most classes, I've had students come to me talking about hypothetical situations. So, you know, like I have this friend who's going through this, and do you think that this is abuse? I'm like, okay, you need to talk to your friend and do this. So what I can do is I can talk to them about resources. I can provide them information. I can like provide them information on even like safe home shelters, legal resources, support services providers. I think the thing that we need to keep in mind, a lot of people, including our students, their vulnerabilities have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Everybody is staying home. Home is then sometimes for a lot of people the unsafest place to be. Most abuse happens at home. It's by intimate partners or by family members, like a parent or a sibling. And for a lot of our students, that violence, the abuse has escalated due to COVID, due to social distancing, due to isolation. Like I take like calls, hotline calls. I know like how bad the situation is. It's horrible, but it's horrible for our students too. And this kind of hypothetical situations, like, do you think this is abuse? Do you think she needs to do something about it? Do you think he needs to do something about it? This kind of questions have also like increased a lot from my students. They don't say that it's them, but it's always a friend. But I have like heard this for many, many times. But the thing is, we are teachers, so we are not therapists. So, but we have to keep in mind that the majority of faculty members, even graduate student instructors, they are mandated reporters, which means that if they hear about any incident of sexual misconduct, they have to report it to Title IX and the campus authorities. But you cannot get involved in something that's happening to in your students' lives that's like completely off the campus in the private settings. Why? Because there is a conflict of interest, because primarily we are professors, we are not a counselor, we are not therapists. I can provide them with resources, with knowledge, and I can connect them with a support service worker. I can also connect them with like legal resources, safe home shelters, but I cannot be the primary person in their lives doing that, because that's a conflict of interest. For instance, in our campus, like there is a healing space that works with the sexual assault support services. And we are in we are in North Jersey, Bergen County. There is Zufall Health Center, there's Center for Hope and Safety, there's Shelter Our Sisters, then there's Legal Services for New Jersey, LSNJ. All of these provide services to people who are going through some forms of abuse in their lives right now. Also, there is HIPAA, which is Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which means that it ensures that we have to maintain the confidentiality and the integrity of any health information that is passed on to us. There is also the FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. It's a federal law that protects the privacy of student education records. So if they are like, you cannot pass on that information to anybody else, even within your colleagues or to an outsider, you cannot pass on health information, you cannot pass on any educational information. There are a lot of legal restrictions. The way a professor can take action, there's a lot of restriction in the way we can act. It's not very simple. So I have had like so many students come up to me like we are like, I think what you do is amazing. We also want to do the same thing. I have had so many students saying like, I want to become a violence victim advocate. But like what I say, you just cannot choose to become a violence victim advocate. There are lots of ways to make differences in the world, but you just cannot decide that you want to be a violence victim advocate. You cannot say, okay, can you get me an internship in these organizations that's working with domestic violence or sexual assault victims? It doesn't work like that. You cannot just go and interview people. No, it's different. It's reality is like very different. Thing is, if you really want to be a violence victim advocate, I tell my students, then it's a very long-term investment, like emotional, mental, like you have to like invest yourself in it. It's not something that you decide like on spur of the moment because you heard something and you were like moved. First of all, like you need to have mandatory crisis response team training. That takes months to get. You get that licensing and you have to renew it every year. So that there is DVRT, which is domestic violence response team training. It's a team of volunteers who are trained to assist domestic violence victims. Their primary purpose is to offer like emergency support or referrals to victims of domestic violence. Then they start training, which is sexual assault response team training, which assists victims in case of a sexual assault. So basically for the SART volunteers, they are the confidential sexual advocates in the state of New Jersey. They are present during medical and law enforcement procedures after a sexual assault has happened, an incident has happened. They have to go over to that incident place and they have to provide services. They provide resources, provide support, information about victims' rights under the laws or referrals, or else a SAT, confidential sexual assault advocate, can also take hotline calls. Like I do both, but I primarily take hotline calls. There are like hotline numbers for sexual assault and domestic violence in support services centers, like Zufall is there, and there are a lot of other nonprofits that provide these hotlines. So they can do that. Like you just cannot like go into an organization and think about working with them or take an internship. It doesn't work like that. Then there is this like question of secondary trauma. I tell my students all the time. So, you know, like the professionals who are dealing with people who are traumatized, they hear like these tales of like extreme human suffering, the helplessness and horror, and then that can cause you psychological symptoms. Because when you're hearing like survivors' account of trauma, you get that secondary trauma. It's an indirect exposure to trauma through a first-hand account. And the symptoms are almost like similar to PTSD. It's also referred to as like compassion fatigue and vicarious traumatization. Now, this is not like something that you can take lightly. So you like, obviously like some of them that they really, really want to go, but there should be a lot of thought processes that's built into it. Thing is like, because if you work as a violence victim advocate, you're working with real people. It's very different from like when we are like writing a paper, doing research in academia, because it's like secondary data, they're human subjects, like we are not really invested in them. But then here you're talking to a person who's just like you, and that person is going through violence in their lives. You might even like know them. And this is very, initially it's extremely shocking. It creates a lot of trauma in the advocate himself or herself, because this is a person just like me who's going through this. Because in our mind, sometimes we think like this happens to other people. It doesn't happen to me, it doesn't happen to people we know. But then it happens to us, we understand. But even then we have that barrier. When we see people who are just like us, who are going through this trauma, I think we get traumatized ourselves. So this is, even like when I teach this, I always try to make them understand like real life is very different. You learn about things in class. Yes, I'll learn about things in academia, but if you really want to implement in real life, you also have to be ready for a lot of things. So ultimately, like 3 overarching commitments for the communication activism pedagogy. You have to reconcile students' vision for justice to the realities of injustice around them, like what I was saying, like what we think are injustices. In real life, things can turn out to be very different when you really work in real life. To work within the classroom to create an inclusive democratic space where everybody's voices gets heard, and then to work collectively against oppression as activists. The thing is, I always tell my students, like, you know, like that's fantastic, but the first place to do that is to understand where you stand, because I think a lot of my students, they want to be activists, but sometimes they realize that they also need help. I think it starts from there, because you cannot be an activist without understanding whether you yourself need help. A lot of them, they need help because of COVID. They are in situations which are less than ideal. They are in abusive situations, living in their homes, and sometimes they want to reach out to us the teachers, they cannot say that directly, but they do want to reach out to us. That's the first step. That's the first step in being an activist. Like, you understand, if you are going to abuse yourself, you need to learn to recognize that abuse. That's where I start from. But thank you.
Wow. All your, so I have questions for each one of you. I'm going to put it in the chat because I want other people also to have the option to have the discussion. And I would encourage people to use the chat if they want to. But so we're opening out for discussion, right?
I'm going to let other people ask questions. I've got a bunch of them too, but I just wanted to say great work, all of you. So appreciated. Really fascinating. I learned a lot by listening to you. What wonderful job. Thank you so much.
I guess you guys can get started.
Yeah, I'll get started since I have a question from Yanti about giving the choice of from reflection to advocacy. So part of it was I had to kind of think about community engagement for intercultural communication. I wanted to, and I was really concerned because thinking of community engagement can be very problematic, especially with dominantly positioned students, where the benefit is really a lot to students, and sometimes there's exploitation and to the community partner, or just an insensitivity. And the point was not to create more work for a community partner. So before I kind of wanted to just go there, I wanted my students to really almost create blueprints and think about how could they imagine being a resource for a community partner, rather than just going in and doing it and muddling through and creating so much more work for the community partner, right? And trying to be sensitive to all those kinds of power differences and the power that our institutions have in relation to some of these nonprofit organizations. But of course, also this was happening in COVID, so I had to imagine things. So that kind of aligned. It was one of the more maybe positive alignments with COVID, because I was anyway reluctant to just go straight in and kind of in a sort of a old school service learning approach. But this also meant that they had to sort of sit back and think a little bit about the choice of, I think what you provided.
So basically, you were talking about 3 types of choices. So
Yes.
I'm using universal design for learning. So I give student choice, but what I don't give them choice was helpful for me to look at what you're doing is the purpose. Like everybody's doing the same purpose, the same thing, like purpose-wise. How you do it, choose your way of doing, which media, which target audience, which community.
Right.
The purpose is the same, which was interesting for me that you actually also give them the option of there's those 3 different purposes. You choose which one you want.
Yeah, exactly. And we have, I mean, they've got to sort of, we workshop and they think about how they want to do it. Part of it too was the sort of range, especially in cultural communication, there is sort of the more interpersonal sort of realm, and then the more sort of public and realm. Another piece that I also was part of the choice is another thing that, you know, I'm sort of grappling around. We are often really speaking to white students. We're teaching white students. You know, I would have taught, for instance, in intercultural communication very differently if I had a much more diverse set of students, or if I was teaching all Indian students. I was teaching primarily Black students. And so I just think about how to really design, and I'm continuously thinking about how to design my assignments so that I don't center white students all the time. And I want to give, you know, I could talk more, but I know other people have questions, but that's part of that kind of thing that I'm still grappling through and trying to think about.
Thank you. I'm writing notes and I'm putting like a question for you, Ruma. But please, other people, like, ask questions.
Yeah, Anjali, just to stick with this for a second, what do they do with the toolkit when they're done?
So this was the first time I did it. So as I said, it was like a blueprint they just sort of presented. it's a good question, because I learned from my engineering and architecture faculty, because we would sort of have faculty workshops around it. They said that you don't have to feel that they've got it, because I was like worried about, there's still work to be done, right? These are sophomores doing it. They said, do what we do. We don't finish it up in one class. They can hand it over to the next class, then that refines it and does it better, sort of works on it, and then it continues to continues that way. So far it was that we did the first time, and I got that permission if they would hand it over to the next class to then develop it, think about it, make it different, like a 2.0, and moving on. But
that's a great idea. I love that.
Okay, to address what Yonti posed for me, I'll start backward. First of all, the model that Catherine Sorrells uses, yes, it is the older version, but she has adapted it to a great extent in her recent, her publication. So while it uses those same principles, as I practice it, and especially in this, not just teaching in the classroom, but here I adapt it to the conversation we're having. So adapting it to the examples and cases that, I know because of having interacted with the international students for quite some time on this campus, and I've been engaged with them, advisor and so on. So I have a sense of the kinds of tensions they have. And then moving forward, moving upward to your next question, and that has been one of the bigger challenges for international students, is finding voice. And they have often been either completely silenced, or when they have found space to speak, it has been as representative of. So what do your people, or how do you guys think about this? And that you guys is where I am, what I'm fighting, what I'm, speaking against, right? So a very simple tool, and of course, both Dr. Ram and I use it a lot, is Chimamanda Adichie's video. I keep forgetting the name of it, Anjali. Not a single story. You're
Danger of a single story.
Danger of a single story.
If you can put the link whenever, like in the chat, that would be helpful.
Yeah, great.
I can do that.
So with that context, what that allows you as you're listening to it, and honestly, regardless whether we're talking about the dominantly positioned students, the minoritized students in the classroom, or you're the further minoritized international students in the classroom, there are ways in which everybody can relate to that narrative and what it feels like, on one hand, to have your own narrative, to recognize, to engage with self-reflexivity about that, your own narrative, and that insert that narrative in a way that you're not representing. You're speaking from your own voice. So that I think that's been something that has helped with in terms of talking about inclusivity, because then it's not about my exercising inclusivity to ensure that every student in my classroom has a voice. My exercising inclusivity for the students to understand, no matter which classroom they're in, they need to be able to engage with that idea, that they have their voice, they speak from their position, their positionality, how their framing has influenced their positionality, what is their location, why do they speak the way in which they do. I was thinking about, as Satarupa was talking about those, how students respond to her examples, that I get the same things when I'm teaching my global Indian media class and about Indian culture, that what do they do, us versus them. So we need to just break that in terms of going back to perspective consciousness. How did our perspectives get constructed? Why is it that those perspectives are constructed, and what we need to continually do? That's where the intercultural dialogue comes in, to keep dismantling. It's not once dismantled. It's not that I have sorted out my, my perspective and therefore I don't suffer from it. I do as well. And I think that's, as a teacher in the classroom or as a facilitator of workshop, it's that position of my speaking to my own challenges, I think helps open up that platform for any student to have that voice. But I will go back to that point. The international students, having been one of them, having really struggled through graduate school in some ways and also fought it in other ways, I think that creating that voice is creating that space, opening up that space for them to have their voice, to be engaged, and at the same time not engage, feel that they have to be engaged, and then the spotlight is on them. It's a struggle. It's a real struggle. And I think that's why we need to keep doing these workshops.
Thank you. I don't know if Sarah, do you have any question?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. This has been really great. I do have a couple of questions, and the first one is coming from a place where some of the challenges to get instructors on board with administering such workshops, because like the goal would be like you could start something like this in your class, or a tenured professor can do it, or but then if you want to spread it and make it a more university-wide impact, we talked a lot about self-reflection, and a lot of people don't want to do that. And so what are some maybe challenges that you have encountered or that you foresee as workshops like these get more widely implemented across courses? Yeah.
I can speak to our experiences as three of us from Rampo College, and I can definitely speak to that. What that immediately reminded me of is some of us carry more of the load of doing this kind of work on ground. So yes, it's expected of us through the Faculty Resource Center to do more such faculty teaching forums so that others can take this on and move it forward in their classrooms. And that's actually where I think the greatest challenge is, because I don't think, it is, yes, it is an ideal thing for anyone to aspire to and want to do it. And I'm sure there's a lot more of the want than the actual practice of it. And like Professor Clark was saying earlier, that, that's where the colloquium came from, that some of us are much more comfortable talking about this and others aren't. And we can only locate and do whatever we can speak to from our own learned positions, as in our expertise areas. So yes, it is a big challenge. And I think if we want, I'll just put it in the lens of the language of activism. If we want this kind of change to happen, having been a minority international student, a minority faculty on this campus or in this country for as long as I have, if I want to see that change to happen, if that means I have to do some extra work, I have to be willing to do it. And that's how I see it.
We have a question in the chat from Jackson Miller. I don't know, Regina, if you want to address that. I was thinking about that as well.
This actually came up during the colloquium. I'm only halfway through though. I was reading the question, feel the obligation. Yeah. And so that's another reason why we kind of moved it beyond the classroom, because this came up during the colloquium, the idea that 1 or 2 Black students in Rampo isn't quite as diverse as we would like it to be. So there might be a class with 1 Black student or none, right? But the 1 or 2 students are almost expected to be the voice of your community, where, truth be told, we have a variety of opinions and experiences, right? Economic situations. So that too is also the challenge. And actually, during the colloquium, that was one important point that we made as the questions arose from the students, that you shouldn't look to a minority student in your class every time you have a question about a certain group or a certain situation, that they should not have to wear the weight of that. If a student volunteers to share a certain perspective, it's one thing, but that they should not feel pressured to represent any particular, especially since, again, students were experiencing a great degree of trauma. I have to tell you, we had conversations about the George Floyd, the Chauvin trial. That was very traumatic for many of us. I have yet to watch the full video, right? So we're dealing with so many different things here. oppression, discrimination, racism, killings, right? But trauma as well. So I guess the short answer, I didn't even finish the question, is that I don't think it should be put upon students, and as faculty, we have to be aware of that, that we shouldn't put it upon certain students to represent any particular voice or perspective or opinion. Let's see. What strategies? Okay. Used to minimize the pressure. Okay, yeah. And again, taking it to more open forums. One thing that I've done in my classroom is I teach something like writing for social media. I teach writing courses. Talk about the news of the day, but from a larger perspective. Again, what are the news items that are going on? What are the issues that are coming up? What unique perspectives can each of us bring, right? Not just one particular student from a particular background. And then through that, I think through personal stories and our interpretations of the news and the issues that are going on around us, then we get a broader perspective, and the pressure is kind of, again, alleviated for those who might feel that they have to represent an entire community or race.
I'll chime in because just to stick with Regina. Regina, great presentation, just so inspiring. Was it mostly discourse oriented, the colloquium? And if so, were there lessons that you learned from that colloquium discourse environment?
Yes, so the first time around, it was mostly discourse, and we're hoping to expand upon that. But I actually learned from my colleagues. And again, I learned from the students that the questions that came up from our students, some of the issues that were important to them, issues that they were dealing with inside and outside of the classroom, sometimes feeling in some ways even oppressed, and the idea that from the faculty side, right, faculty might not even be aware. Students are sometimes, of course, a little anxious about expressing if they're feeling uncomfortable or put upon, or so I think it was enlightening, and that's why I was happy that it was such a wide community of faculty, staff, and students, because I think we all learned something from that. But short answer, yes, it was more discourse based, and we're hoping to really expand that and have more interaction. Mm-hmm.
I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is for Professor Clark, and that is, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by working through areas of strength? And then the next question I have is for Dr. Sen, and that is, how would you, what would be the visualization of practicing allyship without crossing the boundary of going into performative allyship? So those are kind of the two questions.
Great questions. So, right, thank you for asking that. So what I found as a part of just the faculty assembly and larger faculty is that a lot of, and understandably so, there are faculty who are uncomfortable with having certain types of conversations and approaches when it comes to racism or issues that are very controversial, right? And so what I felt this allowed many faculty to do, first of all, provide a model, right, for using our areas of discipline and our areas of strength to share. So for instance, again, coming from a background of journalism and writing, I was able to use more of an interview style, share clips from the news and our history. So in that sense, in terms of our personal disciplines, the knowledge base that we come from, being able to use that to engage students in different ways and show, so again, kind of demonstrating that for other faculty, because truth be told, we really can. I say that, not everybody is equipped, but as Ruma really put it, if we make the extra effort, right, and put in the extra time, we can address so many of these issues within the scope of the classroom, and we should. It's just we're not always equipped to do that. So taking the time to feel as if we're equipped, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
I think that question on allyship is so really such a on-point question, and I know Dr. Ram also introduced the term allyship in her presentation. So I'm going to, ask you to also, have what you have to say, but I want to just, within the scope of in the classroom and allyship, I think it is really being mindful of how you are engaging. So actually goes back to what David was talking about, the discourse, but being mindful of how you engage in the discourse. Your place in the discourse influences how you articulate your allyship, is how others are going to view that allyship. So it doesn't have to, it doesn't have to go into the performative. You don't have to jump on and jump into and have something to say about every single issue. That's again another very important thing what sometimes is lost about being an ally. You should trust the fact that your actions in terms of what you engage with, how you use your language to talk about something important that is happening in the moment is good enough. You don't have to prove yourself at every point. Excuse me. Actually have sometimes students who are really engaged and get into the the essence of intercultural communication ask me that question. How do I become a better intercultural communicator is what they call it. And then of course I go into questions of cultural competence and intercultural competence and all that. So, but you preface that with saying, we're all working towards intercultural competence. So you're all working towards being an ally. Because I may be the person, you're thinking about something that happens to a South Asian community. But when I'm talking about something that has happened to the Black community, I am also an ally, right? So it's everybody, depending on which context you're talking about, you are performing allyship. But it should not become the performative, because it has to be measured and mindful. I mean, sounds very cliched, but it really is about that. It's about measuring the language you use. It's about measuring the actions you engage with. Okay, Dr. Ram, would you take up from there?
Sure, of course. And I want to kind of loop back to Jackson Miller's question as well, because, for the strategies about how sort of so often Black students are put upon and, asked to do so much more. So with the, it comes down to intention, right? I mean, I think we really have to have conversations in the classroom about intention and intentionality and being really self-reflexive about that. One of the questions that is always part of my class discussions is to ask students when they are, however they're responding to, whether we're looking at a case study or we're looking at, is to ask them why they are responding the way they're responding. So, rather than just sort of giving a response, this is what I think is going on, or whatever reaction, is to also step back and recognize that why they may be reacting that particular way and responding to that particular way, what's their position, and how that comes from that particular positionality, and not to sort of just take it as sort of de facto, well, that's my reaction. But the piece of the sort of a performative piece, it's really hard, because how do you call out people who, because it's a very delicate line. But I use this sort of phrase of, it's really important to speak with rather than speaking about, and speak to and not speak for. That's sort of so much part of the intercultural communication approach, and what that really means, and to learn how to recognize those differences and see, like, why do you feel the need to, who takes up space? So really having conversations on who takes up space regarding issues, and why one needs to feel, especially if you already are coming from a dominantly positioned place where you already have so much access to space and speaking, the notion of locations of enunciation, like to really sort of keep reminding them about that, why they even have the need to speak up, right? Without, does everyone need to sort of speak up? And that's part of an ongoing thing with class participation. I'm trying to grapple on. I'm trying to really move away from this notion that everyone has to participate, because it's a very American-centric thing, right? To show up and perform. It's based on that notion. And I'm trying to think about how class participation is more invitational, that a student's participation class is based on their ability to invite other people to participate. So they're almost sort of graded or assessed, if you will, on their ability to create space for other people to speak and other people too. And I haven't figured out quite how to do that. I'm still kind of thinking, but I do sort of spend talking about that piece. That is, but it's also sort of this notion, like, doing this kind of work is not about always the person who speaks up. It's also the person who listens and takes a step back. How do you learn to step back? Right. So that, but in the end, back to it's the professor has to take that heavy lifting work. And back to another question about, what can we institutionally as sort of tenured faculty members, especially in full professor position. I think it's our responsibility to also support junior faculty and tenured faculty to take the risks that they need to take in their teaching, and to push tenure committees or to recognize all these different ways of teaching and pedagogy. We're having conversations about union to do that, so you've got to kind of work at that structural level simultaneously. So.
Thank you. Regina, I want to go back to like a question that I have. I was wondering the 1 credit. That's a great idea that I'm like, we should do that, because we're doing those kind of webinar, but we never, but did it really increase engagement? And what was the ratio of, because we have a lot of stuff that faculty are participating, but students, I don't see that much. So I'm wondering if the credit did anything, or there were other tactics to get more student participation.
Right. So it was important to us to make it not required to take it for a credit, which was why we had such great attendance from faculty and staff and other members of the community. But I do think that it had, and I have to say the dean would have the facts and figures. He facilitated the class. I'm taking it over the next time. But I do think that there were a certain number of students who felt, more engaged or more inspired to participate because they were actually getting credit for, but there were a lot who actually just attended, and they might not have attended all 4 or 5 sessions, right? But there were a lot who also came without taking it for credits. Yeah, but I do think that it definitely helped to motivate students to become a part of it. And getting buy-in from faculty to invite their classes, bring their classes was also important as part of that. Offer extra credit, do whatever you can to engage or to have students feel more inspired to get involved.
If I may add, Yonti, we at Rampo, we have a little bit of a history of doing this as a whole college. And we have always had, what would we call it before?
The experiential component.
Experiential component. Thank you. I was trying to remember. And that some of us continue to use it, although it's kind of discontinued. So all of my students were attending. They were not getting the 1 credit, but they were attending because they had the provision to use that as either extra credit, or they were doing some assignments for it and getting credit for it. So there was ways in which, for instance, both my intercultural classes were doing this because they were learning additional material. They were then bringing into the classroom conversation.
Yeah, that was big. But I do miss, just FYI, the experiential component was our 4 credit classes were structured so that a certain percentage of that was dedicated to students being required to engage in events and activities outside of class. We got rid of it, but like Ruma says, there's still that tradition there, and many of us still like including that in some ways in our curricula. Satarupa.
And again, I mean, I'm putting in the chat, but I don't know, Richard, Lorise, Carol, Jackson, if you have any question, even the panelists to each other.
So very good question, Jyoti. So there are certain things that we have to keep in mind. Say if the sexual assault incident, it happened on campus, then we can send our students to the Title IX supervisor. But if they are just going through abuse at home, it doesn't have to be sexual abuse. And it's not in the campus, it's far away or not even in the state. We cannot report it to Title IX because there's not much they can do about it. Thing is what I generally talk about is when you say inclusive strategies in the classroom, I talk about violence, who does violence affect? I think in our minds and in most of our students' minds, they still have a skewed view of violence, abuse. Sometimes they think it's cultural, because like, see, I'm an immigrant, I'm talking about violence. So they think like, oh, she's talking about her culture. Culture is everything that non-white people do. So it happens in her culture, but that is not what I'm talking about. It happens to everybody. That is something that I make them understand. Abuse, violence is not something that happens to others, happens to people of other culture, people who are immigrants, but it happens to everybody. So that is that inclusive space that I try to create. And then like they open up, and like I always say, like you don't like talk about your personal experience, but we carry on that discussion. And sometimes like after the class, they can come and talk to me about things, but in most cases, they talk in hypotheticals, like happened to somebody I knew, happened to my friend. But I have also had people who had actually come and talked to me about incidents of abuse, and then I had connected them with the necessary support services. So that, and the whole idea of like abuse or violence that happens to others, not to me, but even for people who know it happens to them, they feel that they are the others, they don't belong. And like I work with so many people, like I know the pandemic had made a mess of people's lives, and the abuse has gone up, violence has gone up in most homes, but the calls have gone down. Why? Because the people who are being abused, they're sharing the same living space with their abusers. So the calls have gone down, the cries for help have gone down, the support service provision has gone down. And it's the same way with our students too, because they cannot talk about what's happening at home, because there is a whole sense of shame attached to the being a victim. There's a sense of shame attached to it. And it's not culture. It happens to everybody. There's nothing cultural about it. That's what I make them understand. So I work with a woman like who is being abused. She has the most prolific social media page. She is the happiest person according to her social media. But that is what like my students also sometimes go through, that they are under this pressure to come across as being normal, at not being abused, as not being the victim, because there's so much of stigma attached to being a victim. That is like, I try to open up conversations on this, like what is stigma, what is abuse, what is trauma, how do we face trauma? There's a lot of intersectionality in it, but at the end of it, like we are all human beings and we face it in the same way. Like I am an immigrant, I came to this country as an immigrant, but I'm working in violence advocacy. I'm working with people who have been here for all their lives, who were born here. And it kind of creates an odd situation sometimes. But at the end of the day, what we understand that we are all human beings. Sometimes it's being females, sometimes it's going through the same situations. And there's no culture, there is no race in that. Like we negotiate violence in the same ways. Yes, obviously the responses will be different. Like say if you're an immigrant, your immigrant status is a big barrier in going to authorities and making a report. It's going to be very different. Like if you have, if you belong to a certain racial groups, if you're a economic class, a lot of things that come into play regarding support seeking, regarding responses, regarding accessing services. But even then, like at the very basic level, like I try to encourage this conversation in the classroom, that how we react to violence, how we react to trauma, how do we become victims? That is the same for everybody. There is nothing cultural about it.
Oh, thank you. We came to like 90 minutes. So I don't know if Carol wrote something.
Yes, that is very true for international students. That is also very true for a lot of immigrants who are who are on visas, like temporary immigrants. Like I work with a lot of people who are on dependent visas, who have come with their spouses. The spouses are the primary visa holders, and they're on spouse visas. Also for international students, let's say they are being sexually assaulted on campus, they are much reluctant to access services. Let's say like it's a professor who's doing that. How many people would go and like register a complaint against a professor? And international students almost next to nothing, because the I-20 is tied to the university. The university, if it like kind of retaliates, if the professor retaliates. We have had like many Me Too cases where famous faculty like who get like big grants, they were big time predators. Everybody know that, and they have created a system. And in a lot of cases, they would go after like international students, international PhD students primarily, because they are like bonded labor, and their I-20s are tied. They will never complain, so they know that. So they know like where the weak segment of student population are. And this is something that's actually, unfortunately, like we need to like know about this. We need to like be aware about this. because in a lot of cases, like international students, like temporary immigrants, they cannot access the support services that is available for American citizens.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for a very deep discussion, and I think it just show us how much we need more to talk and more to share, because there's a lot of different practices and ideas that I wrote different notes. I'm going to start, different things in different classes, aspect stuff. So it's super helpful for me to hear that, and I'm sure for everybody else also from our live chat. Thank you so much for all of you to participate in our first inaugural webinar. And I think it's, opening now our practice of sharing that and having those 90 minutes every several months to really connect and talk. David, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Just deep appreciation, Anjali, Ruma, Regina, Satarupa, wonderful presentations, really thought-provoking stuff. I put something in the link to in the chat to a book that I was thinking about as Anjali was talking about her course about grading justice, which you might be interested in. But very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone have a great Saturday.